I woke up to my wife screaming, a sound so raw, so full of panic, that it made my heart stop cold. I sprinted out of bed, feet barely touching the ground, as I ran toward the front door. And then I saw her, Linda, my wife, trapped. Her wheelchair wasn't moving, not because she couldn't, because she had been chained. A thick, rusted chain wrapped around her wheelchair, locked to the porch railing. A bright red HOA violation notice taped to her chest. Unapproved wheelchair ramp. Daily fine, $500. My vision blurred with rage. My hands shook as I reached for the chain. But as I looked up, I saw them, standing at the end of our driveway, watching, smirking. Martha Caldwell, the HOA president. She lifted her phone and took a picture. That's when I knew this wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about rules. This was personal. And I was about to make them regret every single thing. The move was supposed to be a new beginning. James had spent years searching for the perfect home. A peaceful, single-story house with wide doorways and an open floor plan. Ideal for his wife, Linda, whose battle with multiple sclerosis had made mobility a daily challenge. The house in Rosewood Heights, a seemingly picturesque gated community, had checked all the boxes. It had beautiful landscaping, a quiet atmosphere, and an ideal location close to Linda's doctors. It wasn't just a house. It was hope, a sanctuary where she could regain some sense of independence. But hope can be deceiving, and the moment they pulled into their new driveway, James felt something was off. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the way the neighbors stared, not with the usual curiosity that comes with new arrivals, but something colder, more scrutinizing. Some stood on their manicured lawns, arms crossed, whispering as if evaluating whether James and Linda fit their unspoken standards. James brushed it off at first. Maybe they were just wary of newcomers. Maybe it was nothing. They spent the first few days settling in, unpacking boxes, adjusting the furniture to accommodate Linda's wheelchair, and installing a simple, removable ramp at the front entrance to make access easier. It wasn't permanent, just something to help until they found a better solution. But it wasn't long before their peace was shattered. The knock on the door came loud and sharp. 3 raps. Authority. A demand. James opened the door to find a woman standing there, pristine, polished, and smiling, but not in a friendly way. She was in her mid-50s. Her short blonde hair styled perfectly, a red blazer clinging tightly to her rigid posture. In her hands, she held a thick stack of paperwork, clutched like a weapon. "Good afternoon," she said, extending a well-manicured hand. "I'm Martha Caldwell, president of the Rosewood Heights Homeowners Association. You must be James." James shook her hand hesitantly. "Yes, that's me. We're still settling in." Martha barely acknowledged his words, her gaze flicking past him into the house, scanning the stacks of boxes like she was taking inventory. "I won't take much of your time," she said, her voice saccharine but with an underlying sharpness. She handed over the paperwork. Thick, heavy, full of fine print. "These are the membership forms for our HOA," she continued. "Membership is required for all residents in our community." James frowned. "Required? Our realtor never mentioned that. And I don't remember signing anything about an HOA when we bought the house." Martha's smile tightened, more teeth than warmth. "It's a recent amendment," she said. "Voted on by the board. Standard community upkeep. Landscaping, security, event planning, and most importantly, property value protection." James thumbed through the pages. The rules were insane, down to color window blinds, the number of potted plants allowed on a porch, even restrictions on wheelchair ramps that hadn't been pre-approved by the board. His stomach tightened. "And the fee?" he asked, already bracing himself. $400 a month, she said smoothly, like it was a bargain. James felt a surge of irritation. That was more than their electricity and water bills combined. He glanced at Linda, who had just wheeled herself into the room, her presence suddenly making Martha's expression shift. Something flickered in her eyes. Something James didn't like. "We're not interested," James said firmly, handing the packet back. Martha didn't take it. "I don't think you understand," she said, still smiling, but her voice had dropped an octave. "Colder now. This isn't optional. It's easier to join than to fight. James stood his ground. We'll think about it, he said, his voice controlled but clipped. Martha's gaze lingered on Linda's wheelchair. Then, with a small sigh, she tucked the paperwork back into her leather folder. Take your time, she said, but her tone held a veiled warning. I'd hate for there to be complications. Then she was gone. Linda turned her chair toward James. That didn't sound like an invitation, she murmured. James clenched his jaw. No, he said, watching Martha's figure retreat. It sounded like a threat. And James had no idea just how right he was. James had barely slept. The encounter with Martha left an unsettling weight in his chest. He wasn't easily intimidated, but something about her demeanor, the cold calculation behind her words, made his instinct scream that trouble was coming. At dawn, he went outside to get the morning paper, trying to shake the tension from his body. The air was crisp, the street quiet, but something felt off. The moment he stepped onto the driveway, his breath caught in his throat. All 4 tires on their car were slashed, not just deflated, sliced clean through. James crouched down, heart pounding. The cuts were deep, done with precision. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a message. Then he saw it, a small white envelope taped to the driver's side mirror. No stamp, no address. Just a single word scrawled in neat, calculated handwriting. Last chance to comply. James snapped. His hand shook with fury as he ripped open the envelope, but there was nothing inside. Just the words. Just the threat. He whipped his head around, scanning the neighborhood. Somebody was watching. He could feel it. He stormed back inside, fists clenched. Linda was at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, but the moment she saw his face, her expression shifted. James? What happened? He tossed the envelope onto the table. They slashed our damn tires. Linda's face paled. She picked up the note, reading it carefully before meeting his gaze. This is an organized attack, she said, her voice tight. James exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. We should call the police. Linda hesitated. James, the local police work for these people. She was right. He knew she was right, but he wasn't backing down. That same afternoon, James got a call from an unfamiliar number. When he answered, a clipped voice on the other end said, "This is Officer Larkin from the city inspector's office. We've received multiple reports about unapproved construction on your property." James frowned. Construction? Yes. The complaint states you've made modifications to the front entrance without authorization. James felt his blood pressure spike. That's a temporary wheelchair ramp for my wife. That's not construction, it's a necessity. Well, the officer said, his tone indifferent, you'll need to remove it or face a $150 daily fine until it's brought into compliance. James gritted his teeth. This is a disability accommodation. It's federally protected under the ADA. A long pause. Then, you'll have to take that up with the homeowners association. And just like that, it became clear the HOA was using the city against them. Linda rolled up beside him as he hung up the phone, her face filled with concern. James! They filed a complaint about the ramp, he said, rubbing his temple. They want it gone. Linda clenched her jaw. That's illegal. They don't care, James muttered. The next morning, 2 more violation notices appeared on their door. One for an unauthorized mailbox, $75 fine. Another for a non-conforming exterior paint, $200 fine. James was livid. Their mailbox was standard. Their house hadn't even been repainted. This wasn't about rules. This was about pressure. The night was eerily silent, until it wasn't. At 3:42 a.m., James was jolted awake by the piercing beep of Linda's medical alert system. The power was out. James jumped out of bed, heart pounding. Linda? I'm okay, she said, but he could hear the unease in her voice. James grabbed his phone, using the flashlight to guide him to the circuit breaker. Everything was fine. No tripped switches. Then outside he saw it. The electrical meter had been tampered with. Someone had manually shut off their power. James cursed under his breath and immediately called the power company. The representative on the other end was polite but puzzled. "There's no outage in your area," she said. "But that's strange. Our records show a disconnection request was filed this evening." James froze. "By who?" "The account holder." "That's impossible," he growled. But it wasn't just the power. The water was also cut off. He tried turning on the sink. Nothing. The HOA was slowly suffocating them. But James wasn't breaking. Not yet. The next night, James lay awake, muscles coiled with tension. He wasn't imagining it. He could feel the presence outside. At 1:17 a.m., a soft click echoed from the front porch. James didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the sound of footsteps. Someone was on their property. James reached for his phone, opening the security camera app. The feed flickered on, and there they were, 3 figures. 2 men, and Martha Caldwell. She was standing in the yard, taking photos of their house. James's blood ran cold. Then one of the men reached into his pocket and pulled out something metallic, a lock and chain. James lunged out of bed. "Linda, wake up." He bolted for the door. But by the time he reached the porch, the figures were already retreating into the night. And there, wrapped around the porch railing, was a chain, a warning, or a promise. The morning sun had barely risen when James heard the scream. Linda's voice. Panicked, desperate, he sprinted outside, his heart stopping cold at the sight before him. Linda sat in her wheelchair, her hands shaking. She couldn't move. A thick steel chain had been wrapped around her wheelchair and locked to the porch railing. And on her lap, taped to her chest, was a bright red HOA violation notice. Non-compliant wheelchair ramp. Daily fine, $500. James's vision blurred with fury. His hands clenched into fists, shaking with pure, unfiltered rage. This wasn't a warning. This was war. And James was about to bring hell down on the HOA. James's hands trembled as he snapped the chain off Linda's wheelchair. His rage was a wildfire, burning hotter with every second. He had seen cruelty before, but this, chaining a disabled woman to her own home, this wasn't just harassment. It was a crime. Linda's hands were still shaking as she gripped the arms of her chair. James could see the deep red marks on her wrists where she had tried, desperately, hopelessly, to free herself. "We're calling the cops," James said through gritted teeth. He stormed inside, snatching his phone off a kitchen counter, and dialing 911. The operator picked up. 911, what's your emergency?" James sucked in a breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "My wife, a disabled woman, was chained to our porch by our HOA. This is false imprisonment. I need officers here immediately." There was a pause, a long one. Then the voice returned, noticeably more hesitant. "Sir, we've already been advised about the situation at your address. This is a civil matter. You should take it up with the Homeowners Association." James's stomach dropped. "Civil matter? They physically restrained my wife. That's a crime." "Sir," the operator said, her tone clipped, "the HOA president is married to the chief of police." James froze. He pulled the phone away from his ear, his hand shaking. Of course. The moment he put the phone down, Linda spoke. "James, they own this town." James's jaw clenched. "No, not this time. If the local police wouldn't help, he'd find someone who would." James knew the only way to win this war was with proof. Undeniable, inarguable proof. He stormed into his office and pulled up the security camera footage on his laptop. His hands moved fast, his heart hammering as the video loaded. There it was, time-stamped, clear as day. Martha Caldwell and 2 HOA board members sneaking onto their porch in the dead of night. The footage showed everything. The smirks, the way they looped the chain around Linda's wheelchair, the way Martha posed for a damn selfie beside her like it was a trophy. James clenched his fist so tight his nails dug into his palms. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was criminal. He copied the footage onto a USB drive. Then he made 4 backups. Then another just in case. "This is our ticket," he muttered. "They can't ignore this." Linda watched him, her expression unreadable. "And what do we do with it?" James stared at the screen, Martha's smug face frozen mid-laugh. We take them down. James didn't waste time. He sent copies of the footage to every news outlet, disability rights organization, and attorney he could find. He wasn't going to let Martha or the corrupt police department bury this. But the HOA fought back hard. By morning, every single one of their neighbors had received a letter. It was a neighborhood-wide smear campaign. James and Linda were troublemakers. James was aggressive and dangerous. Linda was faking her disability for sympathy. They were trying to destroy the prestige of Rosewood Heights. The neighbors turned cold overnight. People who had once waved from their driveways now looked away when James passed. The couple who had once brought the muffins when they moved in now crossed the street to avoid them. When Linda's nurse arrived later that day, she hesitated at the door. I just got a letter from the HOA, she admitted. They're saying you're involved in a legal dispute and that anyone who assists you could be investigated. James's fists clenched. They weren't just isolating them. They were making them untouchable. Are you still willing to work for us? Linda asked softly. The nurse glanced around nervously before stepping inside and shutting the door. Damn right I am. James felt something spark inside him. They weren't alone. Not yet. James knew there was more to this than just petty power struggles. He dug deeper. He spent 3 straight nights researching everything he could find about Rosewood Heights and its HOA. And then he found it. The real scam. The HOA wasn't just harassing residents. They were systematically forcing people out of their homes. The pattern was clear. Identify a target, usually elderly, disabled, or financially struggling homeowners. Flood them with violations, fake fees, legal threats, false reports. Force them to sell. When the pressure became too much, they'd lowball them on their homes, flip the properties for a massive profit. And who was buying up these homes? A real estate company owned by Martha Caldwell's brother. James sat back in his chair, his breath shallow. They weren't just running an HOA. They were running an organized crime ring. And James had just uncovered it. James turned to Linda, his pulse still hammering. I have proof. The whole operation. But we need someone with power. Someone outside this town. Linda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think I know someone. James frowned. Who? Linda wheeled herself to the bookshelf and pulled down an old, dusty photo album. She flipped through the pages until she found it. A photo of her laughing, arm in arm with a woman in a business suit. James's stomach dropped because he recognized the woman. It was Catherine Monroe, the state attorney general. James's eyes shot to Linda. You know her? Linda smiled a little sadly. We were best friends in law school. James exhaled sharply. And you think she'd help us? Linda's face hardened. She fought for disability rights before she was in office. She will. She picked up her phone, her hand steady. Then she dialed a number she hadn't called in 15 years. And as the phone rang, James knew this fight wasn't over. It was just beginning that Linda's hands were steady as she held the phone to her ear, waiting for the line to connect. James watched her closely, his heart pounding in his chest. It had been over 15 years since Linda had last spoken to Catherine Monroe, the state attorney general. Would she even remember her? Would she care? Then a voice answered. Linda? The voice on the other end sounded surprised. Then, almost instantly, warm. Linda exhaled, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. Hey, Cat. James watched as a slow, determined smile spread across his wife's face. She remembered. For the next 10 minutes, Linda recounted everything. The threats, the harassment, the fines, the police corruption, and finally, the ultimate cruelty, being chained to her own home. James could hear the fury building in Catherine's voice with every word. This is illegal on so many levels, Catherine muttered. And you're telling me the HOA president is married to the chief of police? And her brother is running a real estate scheme through the HOA? Linda nodded. Even though Catherine couldn't see her, it's all in the documents James found. We have proof. There was silence for a moment. Then Catherine's voice came through, firm and resolute. Linda, listen to me carefully. Don't do anything. Don't provoke them. Don't leave your house. I'll handle this. James raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? It means, Catherine said, I'm bringing the full weight of the state down on these bastards. It started early the next morning. A fleet of black SUVs rolled into Rosewood Heights. James and Linda watched from their living room window as the state attorney general's office, backed by state police and federal investigators, stormed the HOA headquarters. Martha Caldwell, dressed in her usual pristine suit, came rushing out of the building, outraged, barking orders at her staff. But this time, nobody was listening. Then, from the largest SUV, Catherine Monroe stepped out. James saw panic flash across Martha's face for the first time. Catherine strode forward, flanked by officers. Martha Caldwell, you and your HOA board are under investigation for fraud, extortion, money laundering, and conspiracy to violate disability rights laws. James couldn't help but smirk. Martha started backpedaling immediately. You have no authority here. This is a private community matter. Catherine held up a thick file folder. She waved it in front of her face. This is a federal case file that says otherwise. Martha paled. Then came the best part. A second fleet of vehicles arrived, marked FBI vans. As officers started hauling files, hard drives, and HOA records out of the building, something unexpected happened. The neighbors started coming forward. For months, people had been too afraid to speak, too afraid to stand up to Martha and her board. But now that they saw them losing power, they wanted justice. One by one, people stepped up, telling investigators their own horror stories. Elderly couples forced to sell their homes after being fined into bankruptcy. A veteran harassed for having a disability-accessible van. A young couple who lost their savings fighting endless HOA legal battles. It wasn't just James and Linda. This HOA had been terrorizing people for years. And now, their reign was ending. That afternoon, James and Linda sat on their porch, watching as Martha Caldwell was led away in handcuffs. The one smug woman was pale, shaking and furious. You think this is over? She screamed. You think you've won? James just folded his arms. I think we'll sleep better tonight. But the real kicker? As they were loading Martha into the police car, her own husband, the chief of police, was dragged out of their house in cuffs. James turned to Linda, who just shook her head. Didn't see that one coming. Catherine smirked. Turns out he knew about everything and covered it up. Obstruction of justice. He's looking at 20 years. One by one, the entire HOA board was taken into custody. James watched as a sense of justice finally settled in his chest. But Linda wasn't done yet. The story exploded nationwide. News outlets everywhere picked up the footage. A disabled woman chained to her own home by an HOA? It was a kind of corruption that made people furious. And Linda? She became the face of the fight against HOA abuse. State lawmakers immediately called for reform. Catherine worked closely with Linda, drafting sweeping new legislation that would ban mandatory HOA from forming after home purchases, enforce strict penalties for HOA harassment, require government oversight on HOA financials. They named it the Linda Callahan Act. 1 month later, James and Linda sat in the state capitol as the bill was signed into law. James squeezed Linda's hand. You did it. Linda smiled. We did. As they left the building, a news reporter rushed up to them. Linda, what do you say to people who are still afraid to stand up to corrupt HOAs? Linda turned to the camera, her voice strong, her eyes fierce. I say, don't be, because when you stand up to bullies, when you fight back, you don't just win for yourself. You win for everyone. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the seats, their cameras aimed at the fence table where Martha Caldwell, her corrupt husband, and the entire HOA board sat, pale, rigid, and sweating. James and Linda sat near the front, their attorney beside them, waiting for the moment they had fought for, the day these people finally faced justice. The trial had been swift and brutal. The FBI exposed their real estate scam. The state attorney presented the damning financial records. The jury saw the footage of Linda being chained. And now the verdict. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes, looked over his bench. His voice was steady, firm, unyielding. You preyed on the most vulnerable, he said. his tone dripping with disgust. You built an empire of fear. And now you're going to pay for it. Guilty. On all counts. The sentence? Martha Caldwell. 20 years for conspiracy, fraud, and false imprisonment. Her husband, the police chief. 25 years for corruption and obstruction of justice. The rest of the HOA board, 10 to 15 years each. As the officers moved in, Martha's mask finally cracked. She turned toward Linda, her face twisted with fury. You think you've won, she hissed. HOAs run this country. There will always be more of us. Linda simply smiled. And now, there will always be more of me. Martha was dragged from the courtroom in chains, the same way she had tried to chain Linda. James exhaled, finally feeling the weight of their battle lift. They had won. With the trial over, Linda didn't stop. She and Catherine Monroe pushed harder than ever for national reform. And they got it. The Linda Callahan Act passed with overwhelming support, making history as White-Heavy checkmarked the first federal law protecting homeowners from predatory HOA practices. White-Heavy checkmarked a law banning HOAs from forcing residents into membership after home purchase. White-Heavy checkmarked a requirement for HOAs to undergo financial audits to prevent fraud. White-Heavy checkmarked new criminal penalties for harassment and intimidation by HOA boards. On the day the bill was signed, Linda sat beside the President of the United States, watching as her name was cemented in history. She turned to James, eyes shining. We started this fight, just try to save our home. James squeezed her hand. And now, you just saved millions. But Linda and James didn't just stop at laws. They fought to get justice for every person who had suffered under Rosewood Heights. Victims of the HOA received compensation. Elderly homeowners who had been forced to sell got their properties returned. Victims of false fines were reimbursed. With interest, families who had been harassed got full legal support to fight back. The community changed. Where once people had lived in fear, they now stood together. Rosewood Heights had once been a place of control. Now, it was a place of freedom. With the HOA completely dissolved, the once powerful board was gone. No more threats. No more fines. No more intimidation. And for the first time in years, Rosewood Heights became what it was always supposed to be. A neighborhood, not a dictatorship. James and Linda sat on their porch, watching the sunset, breathing in true peace for the first time in what felt like forever. We made it, James murmured. Linda smiled. And we made sure no one else ever has to go through this again. Then, the most beautiful sound. Laughter. Across the street, a new family was moving in. A couple with a young daughter, in a wheelchair. She wheeled herself onto the sidewalk, looking around, then spotting Linda. Her eyes lit up. Hey, you live here too. Linda's heart swelled. I do, she said, and you're going to love it here. Because now, Rosewood Heights wasn't a place where people were controlled. It was a place where everyone belonged. Months later, a letter arrived from the State Bar Association. James opened it, reading silently, then looking up at Linda with a slow, proud smile. They want you, he said, to lead a new disability rights legal division. Linda stared at him, emotions flooding her. They want me? James took her hand. Linda, you just changed the country. Of course they want you. She sat back, eyes gleaming. I never thought my life would take this path, she admitted. James smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. And Martha Caldwell never thought she'd pick a fight with the wrong woman. Linda laughed, shaking her head. Guess she made the biggest mistake of her life. Then she picked up her phone, called Catherine Monroe, and said 2 words. Let's get started.